John Bradford, born 1510, died 1555, was an English reformer and martyr. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London for alleged crimes against Queen Mary I. He was burned at the stake on 1 July 1555. There, but for the grace of God, goes John Bradford. He was quoted as saying when viewing prisoners on their way to their executions. This is one of the earliest attributions of the phrase. This phrase, there, but for the grace of God goes I, has fallen out of fashion over the years, but I believe that it needs to be reintroduced and placed back in the common parlance. This phrase speaks a profound truth and has depths that we, as a society, cannot begin to imagine. When fully embraced and taken to its logical conclusion, this statement can help bridge the gaps between people and groups in our society. When we view one another, we tend to see only a projection of ourselves mapped onto the other person or group. By this, I mean we ignore the circumstances that shaped and created the person or group we view. Put another way, we tend to view the other person or people as a different body, but with ourselves entirely in that body, using it as an avatar, like a character in a video game. I'm Link, but I'm Link reacting to how I would act in the situation that Link is involved in. I'm fully aware that this is a video game and my body is safe and sound on my couch. So I'm free to run into that bokoblin base armed with only a tree branch and a pot lid for a shield. And I can hope for the best because at worst, Link the character dies and I get to restart the game. Sorry. I've been playing some of the new Zelda game on my Switch lately. But I mean, I feel that the analogy still stands. We don't typically truly examine other people as they are, but instead, as I said earlier, approximations of ourselves mapped onto their bodies. Kind of like what Ace Ventura says in the movie When Nature Calls. If you were me, then I'd be you, and I'd use your body to get to the top. You can't stop me, no matter who you are. And that tends to be how we typically view the world. The further we feel or perceive ourselves to be from that person, the more incomprehensible that approximation becomes to the eventual point where we cannot even see ourselves in their situation. If you ask someone to imagine themselves as an earthworm, for example, most of us know very little about what an earthworm does during its life, how it perceives its reality, or even its typical life cycle. This unfamiliarity typically results in the breaking down of the imagination. We either see ourselves briefly as a person-shaped earthworm or something else, and the thought kind of breaks down and falls apart. Unfortunately, this breakdown can happen with other humans if we don't view them as having too much in common with us. Instead of the image breaking down, though, we tend to superimpose ourselves as we are onto the person and then pretend that the solutions to their problems are obvious and easily managed. I remember watching a game show called Fit to Fat to Fit, wherein personal trainers who were super fit and in shape actively made themselves fat and then recovered and lost the excess weight while working with a client. This show was an amazing concept. I mean, maybe not the best choice for the trainers health wise, but it opened the eyes of those trainers to the difficulties that many of their clients faced in trying to lose weight and make their bodies match their visions of themselves. And at least one of the trainers spoke about how people treated them worse or were more dismissive of them during their fat phase than their everyday super fit life. This shift in their perspective allowed the trainers to have more sympathy and empathy with their clients and their struggles during this fitness challenge. Suppose you are, as you currently are, and you are looking down and watching a toddler who has not yet learned to walk cry with frustration while failing to navigate a small, simple maze. Now, from where you are standing, you can easily see both where the toddler is and where the end of the maze is. Now, you could very astutely say, if I were her, I would just stand up and then easily navigate this simple maze. but you would be ignoring the fact that you are seeing the toddler's circumstances from your point of view. You will be ignoring the fact that to the toddler on her belly, those walls go up as far as forever. While you can see that all the toddler would have to do is stand up and then she could see over the walls, you are viewing the toddler situation with all the privileges of your perspective, abilities, and experiences mapped onto her. Acknowledging our sometimes privileged perspective can be of value if we want to truly aid someone, in this case, a toddler, in navigating their situation. We can either move into that person's perspective and offer guidance from within, or move the person we are trying to help to a position to view the situation from our perspective. Either case can be helpful. Sometimes seeing the limited options available can help one empathize with the person, and just offering the support of a caring ear at that point can be enough for that moment instead of advice that takes none of the individual's current circumstances into consideration. I'm reminded of the infamous statement attributed to French Queen Marie Antoinette during the French Revolution, who remarked upon hearing that the peasants had no bread to eat, "Well, let them eat cake." Now, advice like this from her pampered position made sense to her frame of reference. If the servants told her there was no more bread, then I guess we would settle for a cake. This statement, of course, infuriated the peasants and became a rallying cry to justify and validate the revolution's bloody conclusions. It is, however, an excellent example of how unhelpful advice or help offered, even with the best of intentions, can sometimes backfire, and highlights the fact that even with a slight shift in perspective, understanding that there was no bread, and if there's no bread, then cakes have not been seen for quite some time, and we are starving. That understanding would make one consider the position and circumstances of the person they wish to help when they try to help. Now, people hear the word privilege and think that it means that they had it easy or that they did not still have to work for the things that they have. Wikipedia, our fan favorite, defines social privilege as understood and described by researchers, privilege is a function of multiple variables of varying importance, such as race, age, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, neurology, citizenship, religion, physical ability, health, level of education, and others. Race and gender tend to have one of the highest impacts, given that one is born with these characteristics and they are immediately visible. However, religion, sexuality, and physical ability are also highly relevant. Some, such as social class, are relatively stable, and others, such as age, wealth, religion, and attractiveness, will or may change over time. Some attributes of privilege are at least partly determined by the individual, such as level of education, whereas others, such as race or class background, are entirely involuntary. American sociologist Michael S. Kimmel uses the metaphor of the wind to explain the concept. He explains that when you walk into the wind, you have to struggle for each step you take. When you walk with the wind, you do not feel the wind at all, but you still move faster than you would otherwise. The wind is social privilege, and if it flows with you, it simply propels you forward with little effort on your own. In the context of the theory, privileged people are considered to be the norm, and as such gain invisibility and ease in society, with others being cast as inferior variants. Privileged people see themselves reflected throughout society, both in mass media and face to face in their work encounters with teachers, workplace managers, and other authorities, which researchers argue leads to a sense of entitlement and an assumption that the privileged person will succeed in life, as well as protecting the privileged person from worry that they may face discrimination from people in positions of authority. So privilege is usually not something we recognize when we are advantaging from it. As the comedian D.L. Hughley would say, here's a quick example for the GED section. I am a man, and as such, I have the privilege of rarely feeling physically threatened by members of the opposite sex. So much of this is not acknowledged nor noticed when we benefit from it. Professor of Philosophy Emeritus Lawrence A. Bloom offered a valuable critique of privilege, white privilege to be exact, in his 2008 paper, White Privilege, a mild critique, wherein he states white privilege analysis has been influential in philosophy of education. I offer some mild criticisms of this largely salutary direction. Its inadequate exploration of its own normative foundations and failure to distinguish between spared injustice, unjust enrichment, and non injustice related privileges. Its inadequate exploration of the actual structures of racial disparity in different domains health, education, wealth, its tendency to deny or downplay differences in the historical and current experiences of the major racial groups, its failure to recognize important ethnic differences within racial groups, and it's an overly narrow implied political project that omits many ways that white people can contribute meaningfully to the cause of racial justice. End quote. This paper, which I highly recommend everyone to read, primarily explains the realities of spared injustice, unjust enrichment, and non injustice related privileges. Spared injustice privileges and unjust enrichment privileges. The former involves a person of color suffering an unjust treatment of some kind, while a white person does not. The white person is spared the injustice of discrimination. For example, a black person is stopped by the police without due cause, but a white person is not. In this case, the privilege is simply in being spared an injustice suffered by the person of color, but without further benefiting from that injustice. Unjust enrichment privileges, by contrast, are privileges in which the white person benefits from the injustice to the persons of color, over and above merely being spared the injustice. End quote. For example, if police are too focused on looking for black nonviolent marijuana users, they will invariably allow many more white nonviolent marijuana users to go free. A 2013 report from the ACLU found that despite blacks and whites using marijuana at similar rates, blacks are 3.73 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white people. This disparity in arrest for just one illicit substance exemplifies unjust enrichment. Non injustice related privilege is typically a privilege that is based on comfort or discomfort in being a member of the majority group. An example might be being the only male nurse in an otherwise female nursing staff room. The female nurses will likely have an established cultural character with which they will interact, and the male nurse will not precisely fit into that dynamic. The female nurses won't necessarily exclude him or treat him as an other, but the male nurse may still feel more comfortable if there were more male nurses on staff. The female nurses, by contrast, will typically fit into the normal dynamic. I mention all of this to highlight there are always differences in how we as humans interact with one another. The interesting point about privilege is that when it is perceived as a norm or standard, we, humans, tend to push it into the background and either intentionally or unintentionally ignore the advantages we benefited from and instead focus on what we did to achieve our goals. UC Berkeley psychologists Dasher Keltner and Paul Piff use a series of rigged Monopoly games to see how people will respond to being placed randomly into a position of privilege. They got 200 student volunteers who were then pitted against one another. The rich player winning the coin toss was given twice as much cash as the poor player, collected twice as much money when passing go, and passed go more often because he got to roll 2 dice, while the poor player only got 1. The most interesting part of the experiment came after, because when players were asked to talk about what they had done to affect the game's outcome, the obvious answer was that the game was fixed from the beginning, and that the rich people person got like way more of an advantage. But the rich players were almost twice as likely as the poor ones to talk about game strategy, how they'd earned their win. And so it goes in the world. And I'm quoting from um, Piff. Some of us are born better off than others, but that's not how people experience relative privilege or relative disadvantage. What people do is attune to the things that they've done. I've worked hard. I worked hard in school. You start plucking out those things. Successful people tend to feel deserving of their lot. As a corollary, they tend to view less fortunate people as having earned their lack of success. So you're more likely to make sense of inequality to justify it, make inequality seem equitable. End quote. Privilege is a factor, but so too is luck. And luck plays out in so many ways to influence outcomes. We as Americans are lucky. We were lucky enough to be born here, which gives us a massive advantage over people born in, say, a small village in Albania or Djibouti or Afghanistan. Having been born in America, we automatically have American privilege, which is simply the sum of advantages given through the accident of being born here in this country. By virtue of that birth occurring here in the US versus, say, for instance, that village in Albania, Djibouti, or Afghanistan, the likelihood of your dying before reaching the age of 5 drastically was reduced to 6 out of 100 live births, as opposed to 10 per 100 in Albania, 54 per 100 in Djibouti, or 56 per 100 in Afghanistan, according to the World Bank open data. This privilege or luck doesn't mean that if you happen to be born here in America to an allegedly abusive single mom, you didn't have a more challenging childhood than another kid born into a better off two-parent household. However, you were still lucky enough to have been born American. That fact means that you could one day, if many events go your way and you work really, really, really hard, you could end up as a president of the United States, like former President Bill Clinton, which is impossible if you were unlucky enough to have been born someplace else, despite how successful you were otherwise. For example, former governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger. As an American citizen, you have immediate access to the foundations for a far better life than you would have had if you'd been born. Now, I am an American and therefore somewhat slightly biased anywhere else in the world and came here after the fact. The Apollo 11 astronaut who flew around the moon, Michael Collins, described what has been coined as the overview effect. And he believed that if world leaders could experience the overview effect, I quote, intractable political differences might be resolved. That all important border would be invisible. That noisy arguments suddenly silenced. Collins wrote in his memoir, Carrying the Fire. Now, personally, I didn't have to travel all the way to outer space to get that little nugget of truth. All it took for me was 4 months in the Special Forces Intelligence Sergeant's course, a combat rotation as the company's dedicated strike force, and my experiences having grown up in Washington, D.C. during the 80s and 90s. Unlike my previous deployment to Afghanistan, this time I was processing the intelligence, focusing the missions, locating our targets, and developing the plans for how we would action those targets. On my first trip, I was the senior commo sergeant. Then, primarily, I focused on ensuring that the comms worked And then I made sure that my portions of actions on the objective were planned and rehearsed, a small but significant part of the overall operation. I mean, well, minus the comms plan, which is 100% critical of overall mission success. But target selection and all of that was mostly beyond the scope of my job, and therefore I did not care to be super interested or involved in it. Contrast this to what I did for my second deployment. Firstly, one of the coolest things about the Fox course, also known as the Special Forces Intelligence Sergeant's course, is a little slash not so little thing called the Intelligence Preparation of the Battlefield Report, also known as the IPB. Now, when I went through the course many years ago, this was the end product that you produced during that entire 4 months period. Every single day spent combing various sources and databases and pulling together all this data and resources to create a briefing on a country that can be ridiculously detailed. I happened to get Afghanistan as my country because I was literally going to fly in the moment that I finished the course and link up with my team already there on the ground. So during that period of time, I learned so much about the history and people and culture and military expenditures and GDP and yada, 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 that I was like a literal walking encyclopedia of Afghanistan knowledge. So now, when we're flying to the next target in Village X of Province Y, I know that the annual rainfall in this area has been historically low, but that people previously understood this and had built aqueduct systems called karises or qanats. But those were in many places destroyed during the Soviet-Afghan War, as well as, some during U.S. involvement in that country as well. Now that, a significant portion of these are in ruins and growing crops in the region is much more challenging, many local farmers have been co-opted to grow more valuable crops like poppy or marijuana, while still growing the crops needed to sustain their families. So the opium dealer would give them money or the pumps required to get water to grow the drug crops so that then the farmer could also use that water to irrigate his other land to grow his family's crops. And during my extensive study of that country during the Fox course, I learned that much like the desert planet Arrakis from Frank Herbert's Dune, that's my next Dune reference, the statement, the spice must flow, also endured there. I know that even during the Soviet occupation from the late 70s through their departure in 1989, as well as during the rise of the Taliban through the U.S. involvement in that country following the events of 9/11, one thing has not fallen, and that is the production and export of opium products, mostly to its, European market. I also know that once we were on the target and doing work, that the guys we were fighting against, if many of my brothers or I had been born here instead of where we were born, there's a good chance that we would have been fighting the Americans, or as some of those people believed, even in 2009, that we were still the Russians. I realized once actions on the objective are complete and we are going into the post-operation questioning of the villagers and other non-combatants, in frustration, some of my friends or brothers would exclaim, "Man, why don't these people just tell us where the bad guys are so we can remove them? Don't they understand that we're here to help them?" This was my moment of that overview moment. When this moment of clarity was when I understood how we, my brothers and me, were being viewed, because I had experienced a similar sentiment expressed by law enforcement members when I was growing up in DC. Those villagers understood the same thing that people in my old neighborhood understood. We live here and you don't. I know if I, insert Pashtun name here. Let's call him Hamza. Am suspected of talking to you Americans, even though you took out 3 bad guys in this village. There are still 2 of them right over there walking around. And there are more that aren't in the village right now. And all it takes is one of them or someone who knows them to finger me as an American collaborator. And my life and my family's lives are, at best in danger and at worst, literally forfeit. Like, you guys are going to get into your helicopters and fly off into the sunset like superheroes. But I, Hamza, I have to live here tonight, tomorrow, and the next day after that, and the next day after that. And it's easier to deal with criminals that you didn't take out if I just keep my head down and try to get by. So I understood all of that. And when I explained it to my brothers, they were a little skeptical at first, but they could also understand. And the reason that they could understand is that we're not all that different from one another. My brothers on the team were also poor growing up. Many of them came from Struggle Street too, and they knew what it was like to not have all the things that we wanted when we were growing up. And they might even have dabbled a little bit on the shadier side of life before straightening up and flying right by joining the military. And then possessing that insatiable drive to prove themselves worthy or worthwhile, they ended up in special forces right next to me. So I can see how easily I could have very easily been one of the people that I encountered there. And once I pointed this out to my brothers, many of them could see it too. So I had that overview experience, and I realized that, but for the grace of God, there go I. That statement simply means that everyone else in the world could just have easily been you, and that you would very likely have been them if you had been presented with the same circumstances. I always try to remember that when dealing with people. I would likely have been President Trump if I had been born Donald Trump, because I wouldn't have been me pretending to be Donald Trump. I would be him. And it works the same way if you're looking at some poor, drug dealer or criminal. We tend to look at them and say, oh, all they have to do is X. Why don't they just do X? I would. This is an overly simplistic view of a person whose life has been formed by their environment, intrinsic personality, and the behaviors influenced or determined by those previous 2 factors. These 3 things are far more powerful than people give them credit for. Those 3 factors make up the triad of reciprocal determinism on which the social cognitive theory by Bandura is based. Simply put, those three factors, which you have zero control over before maybe the age of 5, massively influence the person you will become, because where you grow up and with whom you associate either limits or increases your available options within a societal environment. Now, I could have talked about how your zip code has more predictive power over many health and life outcomes than your genetic code. And I'll actually leave some links to this, in the description, this research, because it's really pretty interesting. But, time is a factor, and this video is already long enough. So to wrap all of this up, we need to remember that we are all one another, but for the grace of God. Or if you happen to be one of those people who doesn't like God, you can replace God with luck and say instead, I could have been you or you me if luck played things differently. So to paraphrase another super famous guy, treat one another like you would want to be treated, or like you would want them to treat you, because they could have been you. Deo Presso Liber, Rangers lead the way.